It is 1914, the first months of the war. The news from Przemyśl, which has been a part of the Habsburg monarchy since the partitions of Poland, hits the headlines of the major European and American papers. It appears on the covers of publications like the New York Times, all due to the fierce battles at the Przemyśl fortress, one of the biggest fortresses in the history of modern Europe. Many war correspondents tried to beat each other in providing their managing editors with shocking stories, images, and footage from the fortress besieged by the Russians and dramatically defended by Austro-Hungarian troops. Those who cannot take photos send in pictures and drawings, as words alone fail to describe all that is happening around this formidable fortress. The first siege and assault on the fortress in September and October 1914 ends in Russian defeat. But just a month later, the siege is resumed. This time, instead of attacking the fortress, the Russians decide to block it and wait for the supplies to run out and for the enemy to be starved into submission. This strategy proves successful. After 137 days of the blockade, the fortress commanders decide to surrender and blow up the forts, cannons, bridges, and all the equipment to leave the Russians with nothing but ruins. On 22 March 1915, this desperate plan goes into effect. The Russians enter the city, capturing over 120,000 Austro-Hungarian soldiers and officers. But the fights aren't over just yet. The final chapter of the fortress's wartime history takes place at the turn of May and June 1915, when Allied forces of Austro-Hungary and Germany retake it from the Russians. Here is a snippet of these events recreated by the members of Przemyśl Reenactment Society XDOK, led by Miroslav Majkowski. In the end, the fortress was retaken, but as it was no longer on the front line, it did not play any crucial role thereafter. The Przemyśl fortress. Although a century has passed, Przemyśl is still surrounded by several dozen different forts arranged in meticulously thought-out configurations which take advantage of the natural terrain. Most of these buildings remain the same as they were after having been blown up in 1915. A famous historian, author of numerous academic and travel publications on the Przemyśl fortress, Tomasz Idzikowski, recommends beginning the tour of the premises with Fort 1, Salis Soglio. We will start the tour of the Przemyśl fortress with Fort 1, Salis Soglio, which was designed in the 1880s and is one of the biggest and best preserved forts of the entire fortress. It still guards many hidden secrets. The fort owes its name to its designer, Daniel Salis Soglio, a Swiss baron and a distinguished specialist, the engineer inspector general who oversaw the construction of fortifications all across the monarchy, including Przemyśl. He was personally responsible for designing this particular fort. Like other forts, it comprised a military part as well as a barracks for the garrison. Habitable cellars were heated with cast iron furnaces, and the interiors were lit up with kerosene lamps and candles. There were also spacious kitchens, larders, and sanitary facilities. In the center of the fort, there were vast armories, a shaft for lifting cannons, and 6 ammunition elevators. As the main resistance point on the eastern front line, Located near a vital road connecting Przemyśl and Lviv, the building also had a telephone connection with other forts. It comes as no surprise, then, that people visiting this place are in awe of this majestic building. Not far away is Fort 3, Twierdza. The entrance gate's name and number have been restored. The fort's construction was finished just before the outbreak of the Great War, during the last peaceful extension of the fortress in 1912 through 1914. Before, it had merely been an earthen and wooden rampart to which a long barracks, cannon sheds, and infantry bunkers had been added. But even the best bunker could not always protect from the deadly kiss of war. Perhaps this is why, many years later, a visitor hung a cross on the fort's wall. Next to it is a preserved old well, in the depth of which water still shines. The fort gives fine views of the area, still beautiful even when obscured by the autumn mist. There are incredible stories connected to almost every fort. Apparently, in one of them, any word said resonates with the same echo. A warning in German, "Stop, or I will shoot." Here, on the embankments surrounding Fort 8, Wentovnia, a fully armed Austrian soldier supposedly appears. But as it only happens at midnight, the crew filming the building in broad daylight obviously did not manage to catch the ghost on camera. Old photos are exhibited in the fort so that visitors can compare it with what it looked like during the war. Fort 8, Wentovnia, was the first building in the fortress's history made out of concrete. Its main task was the bombardment of the Sian Valley and the surrounding hills. Cicero wrote that in times of war, the muses fall silent. In this case, however, the proverb coined by this Roman writer and thinker does not entirely hold true. Among the officers and soldiers, there were also artists, musicians, singers, and poets who organized charity concerts and performances for the poor and the orphaned. One of them was a Hungarian soldier and poet, Gyöngy Geza, who in December 1914 published a book of poetry entitled By the Campfire on Polish Prairies. The volume had 11 editions in the besieged Przemyśl. Gyöngy Geza, who was commemorated with a plaque, died young in Russian captivity in 1917. His poems have been translated into several languages. Then all sorts of souvenir-like little works of art were being created. The collection of Marian Gdula, a valued photographer from Przemyśl, contains preserved porcelain dishes with the image of Emperor Franz Josef, popularly called Francis. Wojciech Władyczyn, a well-known figure in Przemyśl's cultural circles, carefully preserved a unique figurine of an Austro-Hungarian soldier, probably produced in a manufactory operating in Przemyśl at the time. Meanwhile, a silhouette of a soldier in an Austro-Hungarian uniform unexpectedly appeared, as if specially for the film, in Fort 11, Duńkowicki. This large, originally double rampart artillery fort, which was completely rebuilt into an armored fort, is well preserved despite intense battles during both the first siege and retaking of the fortress. During an all-out bombardment by the Russian field artillery, the fort took approximately 500 hits. but the solid concrete construction was barely damaged at all. The most notable damage was done by the famous German Big Berthas, from which exactly 66 shots were fired at the fort during the retaking of the fortress between the 30th and 31st of May, 1915. Most forts had equally strong walls, as during the construction of the fortress, the builders competed against weapon producers. The larger were the calibers of the shells, and the more accurate were the cannons invented by the latter, the stronger walls were built by the former. This is proved by the twin Fort 10, Orzechowce, where in 1896, during military exercises in the Przemyśl fortress, a risky experiment was conducted. Acting upon personal orders from Emperor Franz Joseph, the fort's builders deliberately bombarded the fort with artillery bullets to test the strength of the walls and the people. 9 members of a special committee, whose task was to assess the results of the experiment and which consisted of high-ranking soldiers, including the head of the Military Technical Committee, were put in the casemate of the fort's commander during the bombardment. The walls endured, but one member of the committee did not, as he suffered a nervous breakdown. This bold test was supposed to serve the engineers in reinforcing other forts, usually built in the middle of forests and thickets used as natural masking. After all, the entire network of Russian spies, whose ingenuity could make James Bond proud, had great interest in the construction of the fort. In 1879, for example, a Russian spy sent by the Tsar's officers turned up dressed as a bearded pilgrim, wearing a monk's habit and wooden clogs, who was supposedly traveling to sacred places. Suspiciously chose his pilgrimage route right near the constructed fort. But even he failed to fool those who were guarding the fortress's secrets. Such a camouflaged site was chosen for the construction of, among others, Fort 7, Pralkovce, which was destroyed twice, and ironically, by its own soldiers, who first blew it up during the Second Siege, and then heavily mortared it during the retaking of the fortress from the Russians. Despite all this, it has been largely preserved, and is now nestled among the dense trees and bushes, which from above resemble an exotic jungle. But today, it is merely an additional attraction. Some forts are currently in the hands of private owners, people fascinated with the history of World War I and the Przemyśl fortress. Fort 7.5, Tarnowce, is owned by Sławomir Hanusz, who seeks to attract young people because, as he stresses, he wants to arouse passion for history and patriotism. Indeed, such a history lesson stimulates the imagination like no other. When viewed from the fort, even sunsets look absolutely unique. Fort 12, Werner, located in Żurowice, has a private owner, Sławomir Golonka. The name of the fort comes from the first commanding officer of the Przemyśl fortress, Antoni Werner. An interesting exposition on the fortress and World War I was held in this renovated building. In the tourist season, it attracts many visitors, also from abroad, especially Austrians, Germans, and Hungarians, who can learn about a part of their country's histories, and occasionally hear uncanny sounds of soldiers' footsteps resonating through the maze-like corridors. As for exhibitions, the National Museum of the Przemyśl region is a must with its modern permanent multimedia exhibition entitled The Przemyśl Fortress. Its spectacular and meaningful arrangement makes the visitors feel as if they traveled back to the times of battles of this famous fortress. The Emperor Franz Joseph himself, who visited Przemyśl many a time, for instance while inspecting the very construction of the fortress, which caused great commotion at the time, keeps an eye on it all from a portrait. In order to honor His Majesty, all train stations on the route from Vienna to Przemyśl were repainted. This begs the question, doesn't that sound familiar? In Przemyśl, there is also a separate museum of the Przemyśl Fortress, founded by its enthusiasts from the Society of the 3rd Historical Galician Fortress Artillery Regiment, named after Prince Kiński. The museum houses many worthwhile exhibits. The Society's members also leased Fort 15, Borek, and put a lot of effort into its development. The effects of their work are apparent. What instantly draws attention are the newly restored 2-story brick barracks with steel and concrete ceilings and rows of windows. But a truly magical atmosphere prevails in Fort 13, San Rideau. We are now in Fort 13, San Rideau, which was one of the largest armored forts of the Przemyśl fortress. Once a great and powerful armored fort, today it's just monumental ruins. San Rideau was built in keeping with the guidelines of the Ministry of War and supervised by the leader of the engineering industry of the times, Moritz von Brunner. There is a sensational legend about the fort, according to which when the fort was blown up on the 22nd of March 1915, the only exit door was backfilled and 2 Russian prisoners were buried inside. It was not until 8 years later, once the war ended and the building was about to be demolished, that one of them was found living in the underground casemates, having survived thanks to a large supply of water, provisions, and alcohol. However, the prisoner died soon after being brought back to the surface. The legend is probably just as true as stories of haunted castles, but it does sound good. Aside from visiting the forts, it is also worth seeing other facilities supplying the fortress, such as the food and ammunition stores or the barracks, whose numerous relics or entire buildings remain preserved all over the town and the surrounding areas. Among the most interesting facilities are a garrison hospital and barracks on Slovackiego Street. They were designed by the best architects of the time, and even though over a century has passed, the building complex continues to impress with its grandeur and functionality. Nine gates, called barriers, were built where the roads leading outside the city meet the fortress's embankments. In addition to their military function, they were also used by police to close off the city, giving them the means to control anyone entering or leaving Przemysl. One of them was the Sanok Gate with a well-preserved guard room, which is now home to the Przemysl Society of the Friends of the Good Soldier Švejk. As, according to the unforgettable novel by Jaroslav Hašek, Švejk spent World War I in Przemysl, where his dramatic adventures took place. Suspected of spying, he was sent to a local military prison and almost hanged on the gallows. But as the readers of the adventures of the good soldier Švejk know well, it all ended happily yet again. The prison building has not changed much. It still stands where it used to and performs the same function. Only the name has changed from the military prison to Przemysl Correctional Facility. What has not changed either is the revamped Knights Gate, leading to a former casino, which was later turned into a garrison club. Tsar Nicholas II himself visited the casino after having arrived in Przemysl on the 2nd of April 1915 to personally honor the Russian soldiers who had taken the fortress. Each soldier received a reward of 5 rubles, and the officers were given medals. The magnificent setting for the Tsar's visit was recorded on camera. The unique footage shows Nicholas II, who, after a filling lunch, walks out of the casino through the Knights Gate and leaves accompanied by his retinue along Kosciuszko Street. The Tsar probably stayed the night in a villa previously occupied by the commanding officer of the fortress, Herman Kuzmanek. The villa has also been preserved in perfect. Today, the forts of the Przemysl fortress, surrounding the town and hiding among picturesque hills, are a great monument of military architecture. The complex that once instilled fear luckily now gives the visitors a real thrill and a tremendous sense of awe. This unique building is being cared for by, among others, the Association of Fortress Municipalities of the Przemysl Fortress. Robert Choma, the mayor of Przemysl and the chairman of the board of this association, says,
Związek Gmin Fortecznych Twierdzy Przemyśl, któremu
The Association of Fortress Municipalities of the Przemysl Fortress, which I preside over as the mayor of the town, is formed in cooperation with the local vots and the Starost of Przemysl. It is all to use the funds granted by the European Union in the first stage of the revitalization of the Przemysl Fortress. The goal is not to restore the grandeur of the fortifications or to commemorate the tragic period of the partitions, but to turn a historical site into a tourist attraction for locals and tourists from all over Poland, but also for the descendants of those who fought and died here in the fortress and were the living witnesses of history. We want the next stage of the revitalization, that is, the promotion of the Przemysl Fortress, to echo not only across Poland, but also the countries that once formed the monarchy. We're standing against the backdrop of the Knights Gate. Behind us is a library, Once a garrison club, it now serves the town's contemporary residents and everyone who wishes to use it. I invite you all to visit the Przemyśl fortress. You should give it a try. Come and see the fortress and encourage others to explore it too. Thank you very much. It is impossible not to take advantage of the invitation of the town's mayor to visit the fortress consisting of many other equally interesting forts, which excite the imagination and evoke the image of their former glory. Being in a place where the fate of Europe was decided is not only a great tourist adventure and an exciting experience, it is also an important message. This colossal building, which was constructed for over 40 years at the cost of millions of guldens and took tens of thousands of lives, gets blown up after just a few months into the war. And what's more, this desperate act is done by the same people who built it. What could be a more illuminating example of the absurdities of war? This is proven conclusively by numerous war cemeteries all across Przemyśl and the surrounding areas. These are equally unusual places, all worth visiting, as they are the burial place of former enemies, now resting in peace, one next to another. Remains of other nameless heroes who died fighting for the Przemyśl fortress are still being discovered in the woods. This photograph shows the burial of Russian soldiers found in November 2015. The bodies were buried in a small military cemetery near Belvin, which has been cared for by Zenon Mayer for years. These forest exhumations were initiated by volunteers, among which is Mirosław Majkowski and other members of his Historical Reenactment Society. The Russian Consul General and a befriended reenactment group, the Guard from Moscow, both came to this century-overdue funeral. There is an amphitheater on top of a hill towering over Przemyśl. But here even such a building is connected to the history of the fortress, as it has been integrated into the interiors of a fort. It is Fort 16, Zniesienie, one of the most important points in the core of the Przemyśl fortress. This is where the sounds of shots used to come from. Today it's songs. Back then, the fort was an amphitheater of war. Now, the amphitheater is a fort of peace. Written and directed by Consultants. Director of Photography. Aerial Photography. Edited by Production Manager. Archival Stills. Contemporary Stills. Michal Lorenz's Ave Maria performed by Renata Johnson-Wojtowicz, soprano. As Szwejk, as Soldier. Reconstructed scenes of retaking of the Przemysl fortress. Przemyskie Stowarzyszenie Rekonstrukcji Historycznej XDOK, presided by Mirosław Majkowski. Media film for the city of Przemysl, 2015.